Welcome to the 9th monthly webinar in InGuardians webinar series for 2019. I'm Mike Poor, and today I have the privilege and honor of introducing my good friend and InGuardians CEO, Jimmy Alderson. Jimmy in that world, and he is CEO. So without further ado, I'll introduce Jimmy Alderson.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate it. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for this 9th webinar of InGuardians series. Today, we're going to speak about incident response planning, specifically what to do before, during, and after the breach, because there will be a breach. This webinar will also be recorded, so if you weren't able to join us live, welcome to all those who are hearing it in the recorded area. So without further ado, before, during, and after. So your organization will experience a compromise. Over the many years, I've heard different excuses from people as why they don't plan for things like this. Sometimes it's budget, sometimes they're like, what would somebody want? Or we're really good, but you will experience a compromise. That's not the question. And in fact, it probably already has. But before this happens, it's key to plan. And your planning needs to be just as persistent as the threats that you face. Planning is not something you do once. Planning is something you do a lot. You do it every day because the threatscape is changing every day. We'll also speak about what to do during, how to respond, and hopefully you're going to respond according to the plan so that everything goes as planned as much as possible. And then lastly, we'll speak about what we're going to do after the breach occurs, learning, adapting, and planning for the next breach or the next incident. So before, Benjamin Franklin is quoted as saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And as trite as that may sound, it's incredibly important and very true when it comes to incident response. If you wait until the building is on fire, and you don't know what your drills are, then you will have pandemonium, and it will become much worse than what it could have been. So the first question is, well, what is an incident? And it sounds like a simple question, but the definition is really overlooked. You need to know what an incident is because it's going to be the trigger that starts your process moving. It's going to be the thing that says in policy, you're right, these are the types of incidents that we expect to have or that could impact our organization. And also, but when you start asking that question internally, it actually starts the process inside of people starting to think about risk, thinking about what types of attacks might happen. Clearly, there are people in your organization that are thinking about this daily, but if you can get the organization as a whole, especially the stakeholders, to think about this question, you start to better understand, where your issues are, what kind of threats you face, and what kind of attack vectors might be taken by those threats. And this will eventually lead to an outline of a footprint of all the information-based assets in your organization. It's a good time just to sit around and say, what does an incident mean to our organization? Now, in the most abstract sense, an incident is any unplanned event that has a direct or indirect negative impact on and increases the risk to organizational assets. And it includes both business critical assets and non-business critical assets, as well as both physical and virtual assets. Anytime that you have virtual assets housed in a physical asset, you have to contemplate the attack vectors on that physical asset as well. We speak about business critical and non-business critical, and some people might say, well, why am I worried about the non-business critical? One of the reasons why you're worried about those is that those are the areas that are often overlooked. Those are the areas that are often get more exposure to prying eyes. They may not get the care and feeding that the rest of the organization gets because people are really worried about the keys to the kingdom, but they may not be as worried about these other things. So it's important to think about all those together. In fact, one of the things that you'll see in some regulations like FISMA is looking for things that that are non-specifically important and putting controls around those. So remember, the key thing here is that you're looking at both non-business critical and business critical assets, as well as virtual assets and physical assets. One of the key things that is interesting to look at when you think about your physical assets, you want to think about those things as a whole. For example, many years ago, I had a friend who was doing a physical penetration test on a bank, and specifically on their data center. That person was able to get on top of the building, and there were skylights there with the screws visibly open on the outside, and just pull those out and rappel down into the data center. And those are some of the things, those types of controls that you have to think about, stuff that you may not think about normally. But that's what we can get by contemplating what is an incident. So the next question is, what does that mean to your business? Again, it's not a question if your organization will experience a breach, it's going to happen, but what is that going to mean to your business? And you need to start planning for it now if you haven't already. And if you have, awesome. I assume you're continuing to plan. But in order to build policy around the definition of what an incident is, it's both relevant and practical, you have to start creating an incident response plan, the IRP. Now, this may be called different things in your organization, but this is the most reducible phrase for it. The incident response plan has to be there. And it is a working document. As I mentioned before, the threat landscape continues to change. So you're going to be updating this working document, especially as you exercise your assets in responding to these things to better be able to handle those. It's going to identify it's going to describe how to identify, plan for, report, and respond, and close an incident. Again, each organization is unique, regardless of industry or sector. There is not an incident response plan that you can pigeonhole into, every organization of a particular type. Clearly, there are a lot of things that overlap. A bank is a bank, but every bank runs differently. Every bank has different roles and responsibilities internally, and it has different culture and organizes their assets differently. So it's important to make sure this does meet specifically to your business and organization. And you have to make sure that the definition of an incident in regards to your organization is clearly spelled out within your IRP. So opening up a Word document and starting the incident response plan is a first step, and we'll talk about that in a moment, about what different ways to do that. So let's say you've started with building an incident response plan. The question ultimately is, when an incident happens, who are you going to call? The plan is very important. But if you don't have an incident response team or an IRT to implement that plan, then you don't really have, you only got half of the process. Now, the incident response team is not just technical people. It's not just folks who are in front of the keyboards, pulling switches and working with the bits and bytes. It's also managerial and executive leadership, because decisions have to be made at each and every step of the incident process. Some incidents will be small, and it can make, it's a modification of a firewall rule. And so there's not much that's involved there. But when it becomes larger, then that has to be bumped up to management to be able to make decisions about how to handle that and what to let the executive team know, or when to let them know, and get them involved. And then, of course, there's larger business decisions that have to be made in the executive team, depending upon how large the incident is. Perhaps a large, widespread ransomware attack inside. You have to get the executive team involved pretty immediately. So again, the incident response team is composed of representatives from the technical side, the managerial side, and the executive leadership side. It's also composed of personnel who monitor the security controls and detection devices. In the process of, we might have some low-level folks that are just monitoring intrusion detection systems. They may be monitoring the SIEM output or the firewalls. Those folks are going to be composed of that team as well. It may also dynamically acquire members that were directly impacted by the incident or report it. So it might be somebody who was attempted to be phished. They got an email of some sort. And you may not assume that they are normally part of the incident response team, but because they are patient zero, they will become a member of that incident response team for the duration of that incident, or until their help is no longer required. Along with that, everyone in the organization should know how to contact your incident response team to report an incident. In this way, everybody in the organization is part of that team from a perspective of what do I look for and who do I call when it happens. The IRP should list contact information for every important role in the incident response team. Again, it's the linkage between the plan and the team. The team implements the plan, and people need to know who to call when things go south. Having the contact information for each one of these people is very important, and keeping it updated. And it's another good reason why this is a working document, because people's contact information change, and perhaps they move in and out of the sphere of the IRT. So let's talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities in the IRT. This is a key thing. You're going to want to have members, representatives from operations, information technology, security operations center. These people are going to be involved in handling a lot of the heavy lifting of handling the incident. You're going to have yourself an IRT lead. And the IRT lead leads all the investigations, coordinates the response activity, coordinates internal communications, and maintains activity timelines. This is the person who is concerned about it, is thinking about it, is moving all the pieces, keeping everybody informed of what's going on. Next, you're going to have a IRT historian. Now, the historian is responsible for logging the incident activities. If there's chain of custodies documents that have to be maintained during forensic analysis and things like that, the historian is going to be the scribe for this. They're going to maintain the log of what happened, when it happened, who called. So they're going to start building that timeline. It's key to have that timeline start being built immediately after the response or the incident has been reported. That way you don't have to go back afterwards and try to think, oh, when did so-and-so call in? Was it 11 o'clock? Was it 12? When did this particular event happen? So the historian is a very key part of this process. Then you're going to have the incident response team point of contact. Now, this person is responsible for maintaining situational awareness of the incident in order to provide accurate communications to management and other departments. This person is going to work really close with the lead and be the person while the lead is out in the field trying to figure out things. When the CEO calls down, they're going to be contacting that point of contact originally. Then you're going to have the support team in there. The support is going to assist the IRT lead as necessary in technical investigations. It's typically going to be cross-trained by other IRT leads, but they also have formal IR training, and this is key. Often a subject matter expert in systems and support of and affected by the incident. So you may reach out to that system administrator. This role might be dynamic, and it may be filled within the first 24 hours of the incident being reported. If it's a serious incident, it might be the DBA that's closest to it, the system administrator that's closest to it, the person who has the ability to pull drives or operationally support the incident response. Now, there's some other folks in the group that in the organization you're going to want to get involved here. You need to have a representative from corporate communications. If this impacts the business materially, it's going to be very key to have somebody who can message around what's going on and appropriately to be able to figure out what had happened, what steps the organization is taking, because if it becomes part of public awareness, people are going to be calling in and wanting to know. So getting corporate communications involved as soon as possible is a key thing. Human resources is also important in this for several reasons. One of the reasons might be that, as we often talk about, one of the biggest threats is the insider threat. And so if the perpetrator here is suspected to be an employee of some sort, human resources needs to be involved so they can be kept abreast of what's going on from the prospect of suspicion to any kind of conclusive evidence. And human resources needs to be able to put information back into the process because there might be some sensitivities that folks need to maintain, especially around confidentiality about this, especially in this situation where it's alleged, it's not conclusive at this point. So having human resources as part of your team is very key. Legal needs to be there to advise on investigations involving activities of personnel, and in the case of identifying external threat agents. They're going to coordinate and advise with the communications team when working with outside groups. They're also going to let you know what kind of things might be legal, might be illegal, and at what point you need to start letting other authorities know. Finance and accounting is very key because incident response is not cheap. You have to bring finance and accounting in from a perspective and early in the planning phase to be able to say, okay, so we're going to have to set aside a bunch of funds that we're going to assume that we're going to use for the course of this year for responding to incidents. Those funds are going to cover costs such as purchasing extra drives, contracting with security consultants to come in and assist, and those funds need to be allocated prior to the incident. If those funds are not allocated prior to the incident, then you have to go through this, whatever length of time it takes your organization to figure out how to free up funds. And at the time, now that becomes a crisis situation. And if you don't have the funds to bring in a team or to acquire the tools that you need to be able to investigate this, then your window of time to respond to it just increases. The other folks that you're going to be talking about is the contracted consultants. You need to know who you're going to call if you need some external help. You may not have the forensic expertise on staff, so you need to know before the incident what security consultancy you're going to contract with in order to be able to bring them in to provide forensics, to help manage the incident response if you need to have some folks in there doing that, and to provide some subject matter expertise. And finally, the last roles and responsibilities inside of the incident response team will be the managed service security provider, if you have one. You might need them to reach out and make modifications on firewalls. You might need them to provide information to you, logs of intrusion detection systems that have been recording what was going on, specifically looking for certain IP addresses perhaps, or certain types of traffic. Again, it's key to have a communication with all of these people before the incident so that everybody knows what's required of them, what might happen, and how they're going to fit into the process. This is incredibly key with third parties like your contracted consultants and your managed security, your service security provider, because they need to be ready to deliver logs within a appropriate time frame. Hopefully you have a service level agreement with them that requires them to do that, and hopefully, and we'll talk about exercising these later, but hopefully they're exercised in the process of getting those over to your team. Now, there will be other players in your incident response team during the incident. There's roles that may be needed during the incident. It's important to have a list of the important people to contact. So as I mentioned before, in the IRP, you need to have a contact information for all of your incident response team members, not just for those who are internal to your organization, but also external. And then once the legal team has had a chance to weigh in on what next steps might be needed to be taken from a business perspective, there are several authorities that may need to be notified or could provide assistance. Again, you don't want to reach out just willy-nilly and contact your local authorities without going through the proper channels inside your organization, because anytime you contact someone outside of your organization, you are going to potentially put the organization at risk because now the information is out there and it's known. You would hope that some of the authorities would maintain this close to the vest, but you don't know that they will. And if you don't have an agreement with them that states that they will, then they may not. So please make sure that you go through the proper channels before contacting them. Now, some of these folks are the local police and FBI field office. If you haven't gotten a chance to meet your local FBI agent that handles cybercrime and things of that nature, please do. They are more than happy to go out and have a lunch with you, get to know you, form a relationship. You can better understand, how capable that particular individual is going to be in helping you with these types of situations. And then when you call them, it's not just somebody who's having an incident, it's just another one on the list of their day. They know you, they got a name, they got a face, and they understand more about your business, and they have a personal relationship with you. So reach out and contact them and do that periodically so that you can keep people abreast of what's going on. The FBI is always interested in what's going on from an incident perspective as well. But please also keep in mind that there's only so much the FBI can do. As far as opening up an investigation, the last time I checked, I think they need at least something like $300,000 materially impacted to the business before a full-on investigation is open. But even before that is open, they can provide a lot of advice. Sometimes the FBI will have tools that can help you, especially in cases like ransomware. They may have an ability or a tool already for a particular type of ransomware that might be able to pull out the key that you're looking for out of memory that the ransomware is expecting you to type in. So please do reach out to them. Other folks that are going to be involved during an incident is going to be your regulatory agencies. Whether it be the financial services in New York, whether it be some PCI folks, whether it be HIPAA, HHS, you're going to need to know when you have to contact these folks and if you have to contact these folks. So have a team, perhaps legal, get involved with it as well with some of your managerial group to figure out what regulatory agencies you may have to report to. If you're a utility, you're going to have to report up to NERC and FERC and things of that nature. But it's key to know who you have to bring into the situation. Again, also, these regulatory agencies aren't just watchdogs. They aren't just folks that are ready to slam you for having an incident. They might also be able to assist. And they may see this, that they have visibility into other organizations similar to yours, and they may be able to correlate this with other activities. And finally, get involved with your industry-specific ISAC. This is a key thing, just to go and share information with other people in your industry, whether it be financial services, whether it be utilities, control systems. There's a variety of these ISACs out there. Figure out which one is relative to you and your organization, and make inroads into those. They will have conferences, and you can go and be at those conferences and meet other people of your counterparts at other organizations. You can better understand what they're doing to prevent threats. If and maybe you're better than what you're more ahead than they are in a maturity model, and maybe they're more ahead in a maturity model. But it's a good way to learn. And in the middle of an incident, again, you don't want to wait till the incident happens to make these inroads, to make these relationships. But in the middle of an incident, they can again provide visibility. Perhaps there may be members of InfraGard there, but they can provide information, advice, and things of that nature. So these are the other players in your incident response team. So what's the next step? So we've got a team built out. So one of the things that we're going to need to do is identify risk. We're going to have to identify critical areas of the business, which are points of sale, data flow, data storage, maybe PCI networks if that applies to you, backups. Especially in a ransomware type of situation, being able to restore is key. It's an area of risk because if the backups get infected, it's that much worse. Third-party devices. There may be some third-party devices that you don't manage, but they're there, and so those will be an area of risk as well. Supply chain is an area of risk. Now, this is a little bit outside of your management. You don't have the ability to control what your supply chain is doing, but you have to understand that a threat may come through your supply chain. So the supply chain itself is at risk. We've had some clients that basically have come to us to say, hey, we want you to look over our security policies, not just from a perspective of how they work for our business, but we want to force our vendors who work with us to also apply to these if they want to be part of this. And now this is reminiscent of like a GLB type of thing, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, where financial services require that the vendors they work with have the same amount of security controls in place if they're going to connect to their network or handle their information. So supply chain. Bonded facilities. Now, this is a key area of risk too, and I've got a small story to talk about this to make it a little bit more easy to understand. Folks say, well, what is a bonded facility? Well, a bonded facility is a facility that has been created specifically to hold a particular type of asset. And for it to become bonded, which means it's been insured, there's an assessment that has to be done, typically a vulnerability assessment of some sort. But the story that drives this home is what happened recently with Jim Beam Whiskey Distillery. Those of you who may have seen in the news a month or two ago, but they had a large fire in one of their bonded facilities. So when Jim Beam goes and distills their liquor, now the moment it's put into the barrel and it's been distilled, they owe the government taxes. Now they don't have to pay those taxes until that liquor is sold, but they owe taxes on that. So all of that has to be stored in a bonded facility. When their facility caught on fire and they lost, I don't know how many thousands of gallons of liquor, somebody had to pay those taxes. Now that bonded facility, the insurance that bonded them will end up paying the government the taxes for that on those losses. But this idea of a bonded facility is key when we talk about data centers, when we talk about where information-based assets are kept, because the facility itself that these are stored in need to be looked at with the same level of understanding and perhaps even insured that somebody would look at if they were trying to store liquor that they owed taxes on. So you're going to want to identify systems, applications, networks, facilities, key personnel that support the business and critical assets. So for example, it's not just inanimate objects that are areas of risk. We've had situations where we've seen in the past where a comptroller of the organization received an email supposedly from the CFO that said, I need you to transfer this amount of money to this particular account. I need it done really quickly. So in that particular situation, that comptroller is now an area of risk. That you have to work with them, better understand what kind of controls are around their emails, around their desktop, around whatever those are, because they are also an area of risk. And it's not just a comptroller, it's people who handle large amounts of things in an organization. It could be domain administrators. Now, these assets may not be owned or managed by the organization. In a situation like that, it could be true of the folks that are people. Like we've done business with corporations who they completely outsource all of their accounts payable, and so they don't really manage that group. But if I wanted to attack that organization, I may attack that third-party accounts payable place in order to try to siphon funds off of that. Another example of this might be, let's say, a Tesla Powerwall. It may be an area of risk because it's going to be connected to your network, into your environment, more than likely, but you're not managing it and you don't own it. So it's key to understand those areas of risk and how you're going to handle those. Again, you're going to reach out to those vendors that own that or that run those parts of the business and form relationships with them so that you can better understand how to handle an incident when one occurs, especially if that's one of the targets or a secondary player in the incident. You also want to identify planned projects for future expansion or deployment of assets, new applications, network segments, etc. One of the problems that we continually run into as a information security firm is that a group will come to us in September and they say, okay, we've got this new application put together. We're ready to have it security tested. We want to go live with it in December. We figured, in October or November, you'll be able to do that. Well, it's too late, folks. We're booked up until, the middle of next year or something like that. So the moment that something goes into the planning stages to be developed is the moment you want to start looking at the risk that's inherent with it. Again, it's going to be a working process. You're going to want to have a member of the incident response team be aware of these projects that are coming up so they can start to identify risk in those areas and figure out what needs to be done from a security perspective to help to ameliorate those risks. And conducting a security review of all current and upcoming information technology and operation technology projects is a great way to evaluate the risks that deployment of these pose to your organization. So again, be always on the lookout. The wolf is always at the door. And the areas of risk, again, the key takeaways here, you may not manage them, you may not own them, but they are going to impact your business, and so you need to be prepared to work with them in the scope of an incident. The other thing you want to do is categorize incidents, come up with those. You're going to want to define them. It allows the business to determine how many members of the incident response team and which roles need to be involved. Is it handling just a small little area? that can be handled quickly, or is it a widespread ransomware attack of some sort? Who needs to be involved? This is part of your incident response plan, categorizing those incidents so you know who to pull in when. And again, the categories can be as simple as a 3-tier set of categories that are just based on number of impacted devices and the assumed risk posed to the business by those devices or by the incident as a whole. Again, each organization is going to tailor these to their own specific business and its operations, and it's very important you do, because as you tailor them, you are reflecting and you're thinking and you're contemplating. If you just try to shoehorn something in and say, well, that sounds like it should work, without thinking about the needs of the business, then I can guarantee you it's not going to work as well as it would if you thought about tailoring it to the business. So now that you've got your plan, now you've got your team, how are you going to prepare for the unknown? How are you going to be able to deal with what's coming down the pike? Some things you may know, like, oh, I might get hit with ransomware, but there's a lot of types of incidents you may not know. And you don't know how your team is going to respond to them until an incident actually happens. So, having team members who've gone through incidents before is a good thing, but perhaps they went through an incident in another organization. It's even better if you can have a team that has gone through the incident together to galvanize that team so they know what works, what doesn't. The incident response plan can be tailored accordingly to that. So one of the ways that you can prepare for this is tabletop exercises. They're good. They're a good way to test the process, learn where issues need to be ironed out before it actually happens. Now, there's going to be different types of tabletop exercises. Some may only involve the technical side. Some may only involve the managerial side. Some may only involve the executive side, and some may involve all three, so that you can actually work out the processes, the people, the roles of responsibilities, and especially with some of these third parties, like your managed security service provider or some other vendors or something like that, getting them involved and better understanding how they operate in those exercises is good. So if you're going to do tabletop exercises, how do you do that? Do you build them? Do you buy them? Does somebody come through? You have somebody who's a star player decide to build some up? There's a lot of ways you can go about it. If you do choose to build, you're going to want to use NIST SP 800-84 as a starting point. It is a great starting point for better understanding how to build tabletop exercises for your environment, for your organization. If you don't choose to build it, because it can take some time and it's going to require some dedicated resources, and you may not have those dedicated resources. You could potentially go out and buy these tabletop exercises, meaning through a consultancy like InGuardians, having folks come in and actually run the exercise. And in some cases, it's all tabletop. In some cases, there might be some technical pieces. Maybe there's a USB drive that has something on it that needs to be looked at, so you can test your immediate ability to do some quick and dirty forensics on what's going on before you bring in some contractors. But again, exercising the technical side, the managerial side, the executive side, the communications between all of them and through the third parties are key to have done before an incident actually happens. It's why we did drills when I was on the basketball team. It's why we did drills when I was in the Navy for general quarters. And it's why your organization should do drills like this ahead of time too, so that when it does happen, there's a lot of muscle memory involved. People know who to call, how to respond, how to keep things quiet. And that way you are much better prepared for the unknown. So a summary of before. So preparation. Building the capability to detect, identify, respond to, and recover from an incident. And this is, by the way, the first step of an incident is preparation. There are several steps here that we're going to go over during, and most of them happen during, but this is the key one, the preparation. Knowing how to respond to an incident is usually the key to effectively managing it at an early stage and saves time and money in the long run. And that's ultimately what your business is all about. It's about providing those services, providing those products, but also saving time and money when something like this happens. And again, as I mentioned in the last slide, training as a group is key. Being able to bring everybody together so they all know what they need to do in order to handle that. All right, this next section, we're going to talk about what happens during an incident. And the quote for this is, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," from Sun Tzu's Art of War. Now, This applies to incident response, and so in such a way that if you have prepared for the incident, if you planned for the incident, then you might be able to subdue the enemy with little or no effort. And that is the goal. So what are we going to do during the incident? Well, the first thing we're going to need to do is be able to identify and think of these as not only steps in the process, but capabilities that your organization should have. You're going to want to identification of the incident. Could be as simple as an alert that comes through an intrusion detection system. It could be a phone call that's come into the IRT from someone, but you have to determine whether an incident has occurred based on all available evidence. Now, not all events will turn out to be incidents. Even if the event itself is, nominally malicious intent, maybe there's an attempted attack on one of your devices out there, but it's not actually an incident because nothing actually occurred. Anybody who monitors networks that are connected to the internet will know that they get attacks all the time. Anytime a new vulnerability comes out or a new exploit comes out, and sometimes it's before that, because someone's got some information, they're scanning for those open ports, they're scanning for those applications that are exploitable. You may not have those. So those types of events don't indicate an incident. So it's key to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff and identify when is it an actual incident, something we really have to respond to, something we have to be concerned about and aware of. The next step is incident containment. So it's going to behoove the organization to limit the effects and the spread of an incident. You need to be able to stop its spread, contain it as soon as possible. And maybe that incident is that you have bound somebody who has gotten access to a domain controller and they're on that system now, right? So you need to contain this. You need to be able to get them out of there. You need to be able to stop their ability to move laterally into other areas of the network. You may just determine that they're already in a lot of other lateral areas. They've already pivoted inside and they've got C2 agents in different areas. It's time to contain that now that you have that incident. Malware and C2 code can spread rapidly, taking residence in many systems and becoming difficult to fully dislodge, risking damage to the data and infrastructure. So containment should begin immediately after an incident is identified. How do you contain this? Well, this is what the part of the process is for going through your incident response plan, doing tabletop exercises, going through some thought problems. When you think about areas of risk, think about how you can contain an incident if it shows up in those areas of risk. What do you do to separate them off, to firewall them off? How do you close the watertight door so that only that area is where that person can, that agent can go, and you can stop the spread through your organization. The next step is incident eradication. I like this word because it really emphasizes, what you're really trying to do. It's got some passion behind it. You're eradicating what is going on, because the removal of the cause of the incident, which can be difficult and even dangerous process. It may be so, like for example, in a ransomware type of situation, it may be so ingrained in your systems, it may be dangerous to try to pull it out. Of course, the simplest way is often restore to a known good backup or rebuild the systems involved from scratch in a safe environment. That happens a lot. But it's not always possible to do that because incident causes may include malicious code, employees, and other authorized personnel, external threat actors. Eradication efforts may include removal of code, associated configuration changes. You might have to do things at a lot of different areas. You might have to do it at the firewall. You might have to do things to clean up what's going on this particular system. You may not be able to restore from a known good backup. You might have to go in and actually pull it out with some sort of anti-malware or some other type of process. It might also mean, when we talked about bringing human resources into it, it might also mean disciplining or dismissal of employees in certain areas. There's a lot of different types of situations that eradicating that incident can take. When I was in the Navy a long time ago, I found that there was a individual at a particular base. I didn't know who it was at the time, but this particular system would turn from a Windows system during the day to a Linux system at night. And that Linux system at night would house wares and primarily, copy protected stuff, movies, things like that, that this person was offering at night on this system Turns out it was a contractor, a government contractor, a young government contractor, and the kid thought he wasn't doing anything really wrong because he wasn't using that device during the day. Well, there was some education that individual needed to have. They eradicated that incident in a few ways. One was they removed that system from the network. The other was they went back to the government contractor and asked to have that person removed and placed someplace else. So incident eradication, and it's key to think of it like that. Next is going to be recovery. So how do you recover? I mean, you could restore a system or architecture normal business parameters, and that could be considered recovery. But you also have to verify that the systems, the operating systems, the new ones, confirm that they're not still compromised or somehow compromised anew. I've seen situations where they restore to a known backup, a good backup. Well, that backup still has the same vulnerabilities exposed to it that allows somebody to get in. So it's quickly, they just get right back in. So it's key to understand if it's an asset that someone got into, how did they get into it? Because you can't recover from that unless you know how. And if you understand how they got into it, then you can take steps to mitigate further access or unauthorized access to that system. Also, as an alternative, have a well-developed disaster recovery plans, because those can be utilized to restore service. You may have two different systems. Maybe there's a redundancy of some sort, a failover, and you might need to use the failover for a while to recover from that while you replace the initial one. Now, again, as we mentioned, proper care must be taken not to reintroduce the root cause of a compromise when switching to your DR infrastructure, because probably your DR infrastructure is built out exactly as your primary production infrastructure. So if you can understand better how that individual got in or that group got in prior to switching over, I know that the business operations are going to want to switch over as soon as possible so they can get back up and running, and that's valid. But there needs to be a stop gap in between where you actually think about that and say, what can we do to make the DR infrastructure not vulnerable to the same things that the initial was? So that, and maybe it's a quick fix. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a quick fix at a firewall level, but there's a lot more work to be done on the inside. Whatever that is, you need to be able to take that into account. All right, so we've had the incident, and now we are in the after phase. The incident's happened, we've eradicated it, we've recovered from it, we're doing well there. But again, here's our after quote, those who fail to learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. So that means that we need to not only handle the incident, eradicate it, recover from it, etc., but now we have to take that knowledge back and figure out and reflect on how we did. So postmortem, the lessons learned. You need to analyze what went right and what went wrong. Clearly, having an incident in itself, something went wrong, but you need to figure out why that happened so you can figure that out on a technical level. But also what you want to reflect on is how your incident response team, how your incident response plan prepared you for it, how your team actually operated. Were there failures in communications? Were you able to identify, missing insufficient controls? Were you able to disseminate the results to the appropriate personnel? Did that work well? At what point did it fall down? And what can you do better to modify the team, the plan, or the process to make that better on the next time? It's, as this bullet says, it includes updating anything related to future preparation efforts, policies, procedures, standards, and user awareness training. Maybe you had a situation where five of your employees were phished and every single one of them fell for it, right? Which, in and of itself, depending upon the number of employees have, isn't unheard of, but being able, maybe there's some more user training that need to go in there. Maybe the failure was it just wasn't reported. And now you need to have better user awareness training on what to report. If you see something, say something. Don't be afraid to call us. You're not going to be in trouble. Those types of things. Now, because this step usually happens after a threat has passed, it's also one that's most often skipped. People start to breathe a sigh of relief, right? But that's when you need to be thinking about things very importantly. You now have the time to be able to look at things. You're no longer fighting the incident. All right, it's not time to go relax yet. You still have to solve the problems of how you're going to handle this in the future. It's essential to ensure that future risk mitigation efforts have the best chance of success, and the time spent at this point pays off significantly and reducing the number and severity of future incidents. It may be as simple as we need to stop this protocol from being able to move through from the internet. It may be as simple as that. It may be larger than that. We need to get these other stakeholders involved, or we found a network that we didn't even know existed because we didn't scan for everything. We just scanned for what we were told we had, and it was because that network wasn't being scanned that it didn't get the care and feeding, that it had these old vulnerabilities and it allowed access to the rest of it. Whatever it is, you need to be able to figure out where your organization fell down. And this is not about placing blame. This is about placing proactive action to prevent this in the future. You know, one of the things I think about here is in the Navy, I used to be on a flight deck, and you know, people always say, well, what's the most dangerous time on the flight deck? And you know, the new folks usually think, well, it's during flight ops, right? I mean, that's when you've got all the big jets moving around. That's when you got prop wash coming off. You've got, you know, problems, people get hurt, this, that, and the other. Planes are landing. No, the most dangerous time on the flight deck is after flight ops, because everybody lets their guard down. So that's why it's key to always keep your head on a swivel, is what they tell us. To always be aware of what's going on around you. And so the lessons learned part is similar in this, is that it's not over yet. You've still got to now go back and figure out how to prevent it in the future. So with that, we've now come to our question and answers phase. I want to first say I appreciate all y'all being here today and allowing me to discuss you know, how to plan for an incident. And now I'd like to open up if there are any questions. Mike and Zlata, were there any questions received during the presentation?
Yeah, Jimmy, kind of to start off, how important is it to essentially war game the threat vectors? You know, for example, like before coming up with an incident response plan, how important is it for the organization to sit around and try to examine kind of what risks would they face? Are they likely to face? You know, and try to figure out kind of what are the things that essentially would stop their business from running? What would impact their business the most? How important is it to go through that?
It's incredibly important. While you're doing the process of identifying areas of risk, you know, and looking at the threats and the vectors of attack, that piece right there is, I think, is incredibly important because one, it's important to have many stakeholders involved, because you need to have a lot of different people who know the different areas that might be attacked, but also to think about who might attack them and how they might attack them, because this helps you to facilitate what kind of controls that may be missing already, to put controls into place. It generates a lot of questions about, well, what are we doing to protect those areas? And those questions need to be answered. And so from a security perspective to the organization, not just from incident response, but it's really important to have that understanding. Also, when an incident happens, you start to build a process in your mind of like, what did happen? You know, the cyber sleuth, if you will, is trying to figure out what did happen. But if you've already kind of war gamed that ahead of time, you have a lot of other options in mind without having to be imaginative on the spot of what could have happened, what did happen. If there was a way they got through, what's the most likely way? So I would say that you know, as part of the preparedness, the planning phase of that's incredibly important.
And here's an interesting one. Has InGuardians ever encountered a situation where they went in to do a pen test and it turned into an incident response because they found that the client had already been compromised by other parties?
Yes, many times in our 15-year history, we have had that situation. That typically happens when we run into systems that haven't had a penetration test before, they haven't had an assessment. The maturity level of the business is typically lower at that point, but it has happened several times. In those types of situations, you know, what we do is our folks on the ground, our operators, raise that up to the project managers and up to the directors and founders, and we communicate with the client and we say, okay, we're at a pause. We press pause on our penetration testing because now we understand that we're not the only people in the environment, and it's going to be very key for the incident responders, the blue team on their side, to be able to detect that and again to contain, eradicate, and recover from that. So many times it does turn into an incident response, and we get involved because we were the first ones there. We know what's going on. We've seen it. We have a better understanding of what it was we ran into, and then we become part of that process. But that does happen, and when you're planning for penetration tests, that needs to be a if-then clause inside your process. If this happens, what do you do? Who do you call? And inside your organization, and what do you do to pause the penetration test, and then after recovery come back and do more?
Yeah, and we have two more questions here. One is the communication aspect of IR across the various business functions commonplace in these exercises, HR, PR, exec chain, etc. In other words, non-tech related aspects.
Yes, very much so. The communications piece is one of the parts, the main parts that you want to be able to exercise. You want to be able to know that the point of contacts you have in those different business areas, in the especially like HR and finance and legal, that you can reach out to them, that they can respond in a timely manner, even if it's just a tabletop exercise. They need to be able to respond quickly. You need to exercise your communications channels, because if you don't have good communications channels, both confidential and expedient, then it's going to make it really tough for the people responding to the incident to be able to handle that incident and to be able to get the buy-in, the executive support needed.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that Jimmy not only is our CEO, but chances are, if you call InGuardians because you're experiencing an incident, Jimmy is the person that you'll be escalated to immediately, and he'll be handling a lot of those communications with the executives as well as the technical team, and or consultants, that end up on site. So he is, definitely the person to know and to ask that. I've got a question here. How important are lessons learned sessions when going through IR?
The lesson learned after an incident has occurred, or let's say a tabletop exercise occurred, because you're going to want to do a lesson learned, a postmortem after each of those, whether it be a real incident or a tabletop exercise. But this is your grade. This is how you figure out how you handled it. Something happened, a crisis occurred, that wasn't your fault, but how did the organization handle it? And so the lessons learned piece is, I want to say it's just as important on after the fact as the identification of risk, threats, and vectors are ahead of the fact, because it lets you know what you need to do. Well, first of all, what went wrong during that process? Where did the process fall down? Where, what could have been better? And it lets you know what you need to do, what actions you have to take in order to respond better. It might be that the communication channels didn't work. We called the representatives from legal, from HR, and everybody else, but nobody responded in a timely manner. They got back to us like 2 days later. Or let's say one of them was on vacation, but their assistant didn't know that they were the point of contact, so they didn't know to get back in a timely manner, or they didn't identify somebody to handle those things while they were out. Or maybe it was that authority that you tried to reach out to and get in touch with, the law enforcement, and they just, you got the receptionist or dispatch, and you never got the right person because you didn't have a name already in place or a cell phone that you could call. So the lessons learned is incredibly important. Again, it's once the incident is recovered from, is not time to relax. There's still actions to take. I mean, unless you just had a pristine, beautiful response, which if you did, awesome, but it is not very often that's how that happens.
A couple different things. One, I'd also like to add that if the question was also about how important are those lessons learned during the actual incident, most of the time what ends up happening is that if you actually take and apply the lessons learned, you're preparing yourself for either the ongoing incident or the next incident. And it can be all those things that Jimmy mentioned, as well as something as simple as, hey, the last time we handled an incident, we ran into these proprietary drive cages that all these drives were housed in, and we didn't have an adapter. Now all of our go bags have adapters for those drives.
Yes, I could, and I completely agree. And here's an example, a little bit of a war story that it was an incident, but not a malicious incident. I was working at a large, basically what you would call cloud service provider many years before we had those, security was brought in because they were having problems deploying some stuff, some Tivoli things and things of that nature. And of course, everybody blamed security. So the firewall guys were in there opening up everything. And then they brought, at the time, I was responsible for installing all the Windows NT patches and stuff. And they thought maybe something I did was wrong. And in the middle of the knock, I asked a question like, of course, these particular systems were completely redundant internet connections, all the way down to redundant NICs. And I asked the question, I said, well, have you ever done this before with redundant NICs? And one of the guys, the operators, pulled up his hand and said, yeah, we always have a problem with that. It never works. So at that point, of course, the security team went home. But that it says your point there. You know, if we can say, well, have we ever done this before? What happened last time? Let's make sure we have that so we don't run into the same problem this time.
Yeah, no, exactly. And just to follow up on an earlier question, which was, is the communication aspect of IR across the various business functions commonplace? The follow up here and the reason for it. Follow up: do most companies ask for that, or is it something you have to suggest or push? I ask this because it seems that the CISO has an opportunity to build trust and credibility with an IR exercise from a communication standpoint. But I wonder whether it's a commonplace thought or whether they are myopically focused on the tech aspect of the IR process, looking for what you all have seen in your engagements.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, folks go in this thinking it is only just a technical thing. It is. So two answers. One, it is commonplace at mature organizations to have these communications as part of the IRP and IRT. But there are places we do go into where that's a wow, that's a good idea. I never thought about that. And because it not only affects the technical aspects of the business, it affects the business itself, especially when it starts to get into the media or things of that nature, and all the ways in between. So yeah, we do see things where folks are myopic in ways, and we have to suggest these things, and then they're hopefully more open to those. But it is a commonplace thing when we do these tabletop exercises, and we're not the only ones that do the tabletop exercises, to bring all of the different areas, technical, managerial, and executive, into play across the organization, to be able to, especially if it involves them, to be able to communicate. So yeah, and it is, like you said, it's a great opportunity for the CISO to build trust with the other areas of the organization and get buy-in from them. So it's not only a good idea from a perspective of handling an incident, it's a good idea overall for your security program.
Yeah, but and just to add to that, by the time folks are calling an organization, like Ed Scotus's counter hack, for example, or John Strand at the Black Hills, or us at InGuardians, for example, they're going to be talking to us and essentially building that service, and in that process, we are going to be educating the customer, for example, about kind of how our process works, how we build an IR policy, how we go about identifying team members that should be part of the incident response team, for example, and who should be present at these different tabletop exercises. So outside of the normal organic process within the organization, by the time they're going to a company to consult to help them build this process, those companies providing that service should be educating the client on kind of the finer aspects of kind of who should be involved, and what level of effort the client is going to be expected to play in doing these tabletop exercises.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of the Q&A section. We have two more slides here, and the first one here, is we do have a weekly briefing. It's designed to be an executive briefing, to be able to be kind of read between kind of under 5 minutes, with additional links to go further. then the last and final slide. We have been doing these webinars every month. We thank folks for kind of forwarding it to your team and suggesting that other members of your company attend the webinar. Definitely appreciate that stuff. The next upcoming webinar for next month is going to be the Backup Operator's Guide to the Galaxy. This could be Dave Mayer. He's our head of Red Team Operations, and he's a senior security consultant with us. And he's put together a really interesting, technical, and fun talk about the powers of the backup operators. Join us for that. You can keep track of all of our webinars, including go back and look at our previous webinars by going to inguardians.com/webinars. So again, thank you so much, Jimmy. I think that was a hugely informative and helpful session on incident response. And we look forward to seeing everybody next month. We usually do these on the last Thursday of the month. And, give or take big holidays like Thanksgiving and, Christmas and other things that might be kind of falling around those dates. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Thanks for having me.